What is up, my Shakespearean sluts? Today we are going to be discussing the book Enter the Body by Joy McCullough. Before we get too far into this review, I did want to note that while this video is not monetarily sponsored, I did receive my copy of the book from Penguin Teen in order to review. This book is honestly a very unique reading experience, part novel, part play, in which some of Shakespeare's leading ladies retell their stories. The story is told in 3 parts with 4 main characters, descriptions of which I will read directly from the book. First, we have Lavinia, daughter of King Titus Andronicus, 19, enigmatic and bloody. Juliet, daughter of Lord Capulet of Verona, 13, eager, despite the knife in her chest. Ophelia, daughter of Polonius, advisor to the King of Denmark, 15, ethereal and drenched. And Cordelia, daughter of King Lear, 17, driven, with bruising around her neck. Important to note is that each of these 4 main characters are young women featured in Shakespeare plays that were killed in order to drive the plot. Also important to note is that throughout the book, Lavinia is a silent but present participant. Part 1 of the book features each of the girls telling their own stories in poetic form, interspersed with scenes from the trap room. The trap room being a location within the story. Okay, so like, imagine a play being performed, and in some cases, depending on the particular venue that it is performed in, if a character dies, sometimes a trap door will open up in the stage, allowing them to fall through, getting them off of the stage. In this particular form of storytelling, it's like all Shakespeare plays are being performed on the same stage, therefore all of the deceased characters fall through the trap door and feature their own endless amount of corners in which they reside, waiting for the next time they perform their play. This book is very weird. You gotta be down with the weird in order to read it. It's very beautiful and metaphorical, but I could definitely see it being something that is very confusing for individuals who are not very familiar with the stage. I definitely had to read the book several times in order to get the most out of it, but it was very easy to read multiple times. It is definitely a single sitting read, very much reading like a play. But like I said, part 1 features each of the girls telling their own story in poetic form, interspersed with scenes from this trap room in which the characters interact with each other. Part 2 of the book serves as an intermission of sorts, with each of the girls having a direct conversation with each other, formatted like play dialogue. And part 3 of the novel features each of the girls retelling their stories, again in poetic form, but this time what might have happened if they were able to change an aspect of their story. Again, also interspersed with scenes from the trap room in which they are discussing things with each other, typically in the form of interruptions. I actually really enjoyed the gimmick of how this story was told. I found it to be very unique. And while I definitely think I had the benefit of coming from a theater background, I was definitely able to understand it a little better than perhaps the average reader not coming from a theater background, but I definitely don't think it's too difficult of a concept to grasp for the average individual. It may just take a little while to get used to it. The story is incredibly meta in a way that I actually really like. The characters are themselves, but they are also actors playing themselves, knowingly pieces in a play, knowing of plays and of comedies and of tragedies, and knowing of the bard Shakespeare himself. Very meta. I do think it helps to have a prior knowledge of Shakespearean work in order to understand the story, but it's definitely not necessary. The book does explain enough of itself to where you can certainly follow it without having that familiarity or having like a base kind of pop culture familiarity. Because while I definitely know some Shakespeare work fairly well, I was actually not familiar with most of the plays most of the characters characters were featured in. For example, at the time of recording this video, I have not personally read Titus Andronicus or King Lear, but I was definitely able to follow their stories without issue because the book does explain enough about the characters and their stories for you to be able to follow along. So if you have not read every single Shakespeare play, do not let that scare you away from giving this a chance. It is certainly not a prerequisite to having read this book. Of course, it does help at the very least to be familiar with who Shakespeare is. I am definitely explaining myself, assuming that if you are watching this, you are probably familiar with who Shakespeare is. I think he's definitely a household name at this point, just a very famous, well-known playwright, if you weren't familiar. I do actually think that the book would be a fantastic companion piece to those who are learning or studying Shakespeare, particularly those at a high school age. I think the girls' tellings of their stories, both original and reimagined, is very poetic and beautiful while still being a little bit easier to digest to the modern palate than some Shakespearean English is. I did really enjoy the writing of the verse involved in the book and thought it did a really good job of conveying different themes. But then the interruption of like the trap door scenes almost at times felt a little bit like an insult to the reader's intelligence. Not always, and definitely that is perhaps a bit dramatic of a way to put it, but I definitely thought that it was often an oversimplification and reiteration of like the themes that you should have been interpreting from the verse in a way that just felt a little too much at times, and more often than not thought that the trapdoor interjections kind of detracted from the verse. Now, I definitely think that like the use of the trapdoor and the direct conversation between the girls was very, very necessary and obviously a very large part of the book. I just don't necessarily love when characters interrupted each other's tellings in order to expand on things in the trap room. Those were the parts that I didn't think were necessary, whereas obviously the intermission of them discussing things and discussing things in between each of the girls telling their stories, I did really like. I also didn't love some of the modern language that was used within the book. So obviously like the tellings of the stories was done in poetic verse and felt very timeless, whereas the trapdoor conversations were much more modern in the language that was used. And while I definitely think that that has a benefit of making it more understandable and easily accessible in the reading to a modern audience, some of it was just like a little too modern, and it kind of felt a little bit forced and out of place. Like, I didn't need Cordelia to call something problematic, and I didn't need Juliet to call something shitty, regardless of whether or not those things are problematic and shitty. You can imply that without directly saying that in a way that feels out of place. Also, like, the serious use of the term sexy times being used in the book was not my favorite. And I could definitely see the argument that some people are going to be like, well, like, they're girls, they're juvenile, you know, they should be allowed to use vocabulary that is a little bit more young and juvenile. And they definitely do, and I do like a lot of aspects of that. There were just a few things that I thought were a little much. There were often times where the characters felt very childish, and to a degree that is very justified, and I actually really do enjoy seeing them being allowed to be the girls that they are. But at the same time, often it moves a little bit past juvenile into like childishly bratty, and while there is a time and place, I do think some of the characters lean a little bit more bratty, a little bit more often than I would have preferred. I don't necessarily love how exactly the girls kind of went after each other within the book and how often they bickered. I feel like a large part of the book was them kind of disagreeing with each other and disagreeing with choices that they made and then choices that they were making in their retellings, which at times felt a little bit contrary to the point, because I feel like a large point of the book was them being able to have their own autonomy and reclaim their own stories and be able to make their own decisions versus the ones that were made for them in the writing by the bard. But the girls just bickered a little too often. I definitely think that, like, of course disagreements are going to happen and that's going to be a part of the conversation, but the way in which they were going after each other felt a little juvenile. It felt very high school or very middle school almost. But then again, of course, at the same time, I do enjoy them getting the opportunity to act like their age, because that was not an opportunity given to them. So I definitely just think the balance of how juvenile it was needed to be worked on a little bit more. Unfortunately, I do think we have just gotten to a point as a society where topics and ideas of feminism have been so boiled down and mocked that use of them in different media, depending on how it's handled, almost feels performative. And while I definitely don't think this book was meant to be performative in that way, I definitely think that we could have gone a little bit deeper instead of just staying surface level with a lot of the ideas and concepts. But I also very much acknowledge that that could also be a personal problem. That could be my own interpretation of how ideas and concepts are tackled in media. So I don't know if that's going to be a universal feeling that a lot of people are going to think, or if that's like a me problem. One aspect of the book that I actually really enjoyed seeing was the characterization that Cordelia presented as though she were asexual. And while that is not a term that is used within the book, I feel like she was presented very much in a way that was asexual and almost sex repulsed. I thought it was really refreshing to see that type of representation, and the fact that, like, not all teenagers are just like sex crazed, horny individuals, that there are some individuals who are not interested in that type of thing, and it is in fact increasingly more common to come across that. And I just really, really enjoyed seeing that type of representation, because it is not something that you get to see very often. And I feel like even less often something that you get to see represented in a way that feels accurate or organic. It's very often kind of shoved and shoo-inned in there, and like terminology has to be thrown in your face. Whereas like nobody ever said the word asexual. This is just my interpretation of how her character was presented in regards to those topics. I do think that ultimately the best format for this story to be told would be as an actual play. I think that this would be so fascinating to see performed by live actors, to see the ways in which they tackle the use of these sets and how they actually show the like physical representations of these characters. I think would be so phenomenal to see. And I actually think there is the possibility of that happening, because I did see that the author Joy McCullough has actually written a one-act version of the novel. And for those who aren't aware, like, one-acts are a type of plays that are performed often by high school students. So I am so excited for the potential to see different actual live performances of this story. I think it would be so fun to see, because the reading experience is definitely very much improved by imagining these being like very impassioned teenage girls performing. So the idea to be able to visualize that in a way that's not just like your own visualization as you're reading, I think is so fun. But even without that aspect, I do think that this is a very fun novel. And just because I do have certain criticisms doesn't mean that I didn't enjoy the book. Quite the contrary. I think it was very, very fun. I look forward to recommending it to a lot of my old theater friends, because if it weren't obvious, I was in fact a theater kid. Mostly a techie, but the fact that I had this backdrop and costume just in my house unrelated to this video goes to show the type of theater kid that I was. But anyways, thank y'all so much for hanging out with me. I had a blast. Peace.